council members. I wanted to start with just asking that you please bear with me tonight, just feeling a little under the weather. So, before you tonight we have a proposed legislative amendment for our alternate front yard setback requirement, currently within the zoning code. And so this began with the 2013 council goal, which was to expand the perceived downtown area of Main Street from East Street to the South Couplet, and that was through the construction of streetscape improvements and also the evaluation of zoning and development standards within that corridor. And so out of that, when we had reviewed the zoning standards, the first item was residential uses in commercial zones to incorporate more of those uses, and we had passed an ordinance late last year which did just that. And the second aspect of the zoning standards for this goal was a reduction in setbacks for the motor business zoning district. And when we had taken a look at, and currently the front setback is 10 feet, when we had taken a look at the majority of the properties within the motor business zone, which are generally located along the highway corridors, realized that 10 feet really isn't a lot, not a great distance, especially when you have speed limits of 35, 45 miles an hour, and the sidewalks are pushed right out there to the street. And so in order for pedestrian bicycle safety as well as future expansion of those roadways, we decided to take a look at maybe an alternative within the zoning code to cater to that North Main Street corridor. And the Planning and Zoning Commission had discussed the possibility of the alternate front yard setback, and they did that on October 22nd as well as the November 7th meetings. And looking at the alternate front yard language, basically it just caters to residential zoning districts, so it only applies to those zones. And basically it lets you take the average, so say you have a whole street, whole lot of properties on the west side of the street, typically set back 10 feet from the front property line. Well, let's say the zone requires a 25-foot front yard setback. So this basically allows you to take the average of the two principal structures on either side, which would be 10 feet in this case, and that would be your front yard setback instead of the 25-foot front yard setback for that underlying zoning district. So we looked at this, basically eliminating the residential aspect and allowing it to all zones. And so this would carry over to commercial as well. The proposed amendment before you tonight basically strikes residential from the language, also includes a provision that the zoning administrator may grant modifications to the front yard setback of new principal buildings on the subject property provided. And then basically we have two subsections here. The first one is just basically the same language that's carried over from the current language within the code. Basically just says you can take the average of the two adjacent properties, and that becomes basically your front yard setback. But we also included a provision in here that lets you take 60% or more of the principal buildings within a numbered block on the same side of the street as the subject property, as long as those are set back less than the required zone front yard setback. The average setback of the existing nonconforming structures may be used to establish the minimum front yard of all the properties fronting on that side of the street. And just to explain what that means, so let's take, for instance, our subject area, which is the North Main Street corridor here, currently motor business. Well, right now you have a front yard setback of 10 feet. So if we look at the property that's outlined in red, even if we applied so say you wanted to do an addition off this property, or let's say it's just vacant or it burns down and the property owner wants to rebuild. Well, right away you have to have a 10-foot front yard setback, so it's not going to resemble the other structures that are built within this area. As you can tell, they're built right up to the front property lines. So if you apply the alternate front yard setback, basically gets you really not anywhere, just because you have this property that's set back maybe 20, 30 feet. So if you were to take the average of this setback along with this setback, which is 0, basically you're in that 10, 15-foot setback requirement. And so applying the 60% rule under that proposed amendment, you take the average setback of 60% or more of the structures on that same side of the block, same street, and basically it would let you, looking at these, basically have a 0 front setback, as well as the water department building down here is a 0 setback. And so that basically becomes your setback for the property here. And so that allows us, at least within this quarter of the zone motor business, as well as other commercial residential zones, allows you to replicate kind of the existing developed form within that area. And this also applies to, a common occurrence that we've seen in dealing with residential properties. So you can see the property that's outlined in red, that east side of the street. All the buildings predominantly have the same setback, and that's pretty close to the back edge of the sidewalk. Well, you have a road property here that's built 30 feet back, doesn't really resemble any of the other structures on that same block. This building were to burn down, or if, let's say it's vacant right now, basically maybe you have a 15, 20-foot setback within that zone. You'd be building somewhere back here. If you were to apply the average front yard setback, basically be in the same area, 15 to 20 feet back. And so that's what the 60% provision allows you to do, is to take the average setback of all those structures on that block, and that basically becomes your front yard setback. So with that, Planning and Zoning Commission did take a look at this and conduct a public hearing on December 10th, and they recommended unanimous approval to City Council. And staff's recommendation before you tonight is to conduct a public hearing, and upon consideration of testimony received, approve the ordinance under suspension of the rules, requiring 3 complete and separate readings, and that it be read by title and published by summary. I'd certainly be able to answer any questions that you might have.
Wayne?
Mike, how does this affect, or does it affect a residential area that, for instance, they have no sidewalks? When it was designed, it was built without sidewalks. Normally, the setback, the right-of-way is, what, 10 feet?
It really just depends what area you're in. Some right-of-ways are 80 feet in older neighborhoods.
Well, the point being that the front of the houses are all consistent within the neighborhood, and the setback is 25 feet. Does this affect that at all, where they can add on to the house, which would actually put it closer to the street? Follow what I'm saying?
Well, it allows for more options. So if you have your neighbors that are closer to the street than you are, and you want to do an addition, but maybe say you're at the 25-foot front yard setback mark, this allows for you to duplicate the 2 adjacent properties, and that becomes your front yard setback. And so basically it allows for people to go up further into that front yard setback just because your neighbors have already been allowed to do that at some point in time.
Other questions for Mike before I open this thing up for public hearing? Okay, thank you, Michael. I am going to open this up for public hearing as of right now, and I will entertain approval. People that are in favor of this, please stand up, state your name and address, and let us know your thoughts. Seeing nobody come forward, I will ask for general comments or opposed opposition to this. Please step forward, state your name at the podium. Okay, seeing none, I will close the public hearing. John.
I'm the council liaison for for planning and zoning, and Mike has done a fine job on addressing the situation, and planning and zoning did a very thorough job and discussed this particular issue, as they do all issues from all sides. And what they came up with is, I think, something that can be worked with all of the areas of the city, and it will allow, like Mike just said, some freedom if you have to rebuild or you want to put an addition on, so that if you are not necessarily out of compliance, but if you're not in accordance with your neighbors and you choose to, you can bring yourself into accordance with their front yard setbacks. And then in the commercial districts, what it's going to do, it will allow the building or the rebuilding of any part of the commercial construction to look more like it'll give the same appearance as you go down the street. So actually, if you're ready for a motion, I'm ready to
Well,
make one.
Before you do that, John, I'd happy to entertain what I'd like to hear from Jim Boland, because he was on planning and zoning during this whole, and get his thoughts on this as well.
I'd have to say that John's recapping that pretty well. There was a lot of discussion about it, and it was looked at on a number of different times, and the options that staff has come up with to do this make it as fair as it could possibly be to add on or rebuild a property in the context that you'd like to see it done. So I think they've done a great job, and I voted to approve it at when I was on planning and zoning, and certainly would now.
Okay. John? I'll give the floor back to you.
Then I would move that we approve this under suspension, approve this ordinance under suspension of the rules requiring 3 complete and separate readings, and that it be read by title and published by summary.
I'll second that.
Okay. John Weber made a motion to approve this ordinance under the suspension of the rules requiring 3 complete and separate readings, and that it be read by title and published by summary, and it was seconded by Jim Boland. I will take the roll, starting with Walter.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, that passes through 6-1, so 6-0. This is ordinance number 2015-01. Stephanie? It is. Okay. An ordinance of the City of Moscow, Idaho, a municipal corporation of the state of Idaho, providing for the amendment of Moscow City Code Title 4, Chapter 6, for amendment of alternate setback requirements for commercial zoning districts, providing that the provisions of this ordinance be deemed severable, and providing for this ordinance to be in full force and effect from the date of its passage, approval, and a publication according to law.